The first thing you need to understand about what happened over the Bering Strait on March 15, 2024, is that nobody was supposed to be there. Not the Russian Sukhoi Su-57 Felon that appeared on radar at 14:23 local time. Not the pair of F-22 Raptors scrambled from Elmendorf-Richardson Air Base. And certainly not Captain Vera, Frostbite, Kozlova, whose MiG-29 shouldn't have existed according to every intelligence briefing filed in the past 18 months. The morning started like any other Arctic patrol. Captain Marcus, Viper, Thompson and First Lieutenant David Ghost, Rays had been airborne for 47 minutes, their twin Pratt & Whitney F-119 engines cutting through crystalline air at 38,000 feet. The Alaskan wilderness stretched beneath them like a frozen ocean, broken only by the occasional mountain peak piercing through cloud cover. Thompson adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his instruments for the third time in 10 minutes, a habit born from 11 years of flying the world's most sophisticated fighter jet. Viper Ghost, this is Overwatch. We have an unknown contact bearing 027, range 80 nautical miles, altitude climbing through flight level 350. The voice of Technical Sergeant Riley Martinez crackled through their headsets from the control room at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, where she'd been tracking what appeared to be a routine Russian patrol flight. Thompson's gloved hand moved instinctively to his weapon systems panel. Copy, Overwatch, designating unknown contact as Bandit 1. Ghost, you getting this? Affirm, Viper. IFF showing negative. Whatever it is, it's not squawking friendly. Rays banked his F-22 slightly left, the aircraft's distinctive diamond-shaped profile cutting through wisps of cirrus clouds. His heads-up display painted the mystery aircraft as a red diamond, still too distant for visual identification. What none of them knew, what couldn't have been known from their position 60 miles southwest of the contact, was that the aircraft climbing toward them carried a pilot whose name had been scratched from official records, whose existence had been denied by 3 governments, and whose next decision would prevent what analysts would later call the closest the world had come to accidental nuclear war since Stanislav Petrov's choice in 1983. The sky held its breath, and in that silence everything changed. Captain Thompson's targeting computer achieved lock at exactly 14:31:42 local time. His finger hovered over the weapon release button as protocol demanded. The rules of engagement were clear. Unknown aircraft in restricted airspace refusing to respond to radio challenges constituted a threat to national security. But something about the way the distant aircraft moved, a subtle roll to the right, then left, then right again, made him hesitate. That hesitation saved 12 million lives. In the sprawling complex beneath Cheyenne Mountain, General Patricia, Iron Lady, Harrison stood before a wall of monitors displaying the tactical situation developing over the Bering Strait. Her steel-gray hair was pulled into a regulation bun that hadn't moved in 30 years of military service, and her weathered hands clasped behind her back as she processed incoming data streams from NORAD, the Pentagon, and allied intelligence sources across 3 continents. "Ma'am, the F-22s are in position," reported Colonel James "Bulldog" Stevens, his thick Boston accent cutting through the controlled chaos of the command center. Stevens had been Harrison's operations chief for 6 years, and she trusted his judgment more than the computer algorithms that painted threat assessments across her screens. Bandit 1 is maintaining course and altitude. No response to radio challenges on any frequency. Harrison's pale blue eyes, sharpened by decades of making life-and-death decisions, studied the tactical display. The unknown aircraft's flight path traced a perfect line toward restricted airspace, but something felt wrong. In her experience, Russian pilots testing NATO response times typically flew more aggressive patterns, sharp turns, altitude changes, electronic warfare signatures. This contact flew with the steady precision of a commercial airliner, yet no civilian aircraft had filed flight plans for this corridor. Electronic signature analysis, she asked without turning from the display. Technical Sergeant Martinez's voice came through the speakers with barely controlled excitement. "Ma'am, that's where it gets interesting. We're reading partial stealth characteristics, but the RCS pattern doesn't match any known Russian aircraft. It's like they've somehow modified a fourth-generation fighter with fifth-generation technology." The general's jaw tightened. Intelligence briefings had hinted at such possibilities, upgraded MiG-29s equipped with experimental stealth modifications. But seeing it on radar was different than reading classified reports. If the Russians had successfully retrofitted their older aircraft with modern stealth capabilities, it represented a significant shift in the regional balance of power. "What's the range to target?" Harrison asked. 72 nautical miles and closing, ma'am. Our Raptors have achieved radar lock and are awaiting authorization." Harrison's fingers drummed against her leg, a nervous habit she developed during her first command in Afghanistan. The decision tree was clear: authorize weapons release and eliminate the threat, or risk allowing an enemy aircraft to penetrate American airspace. But something about this situation felt different, felt wrong in ways her analytical mind couldn't quite process. 3,000 miles away, Captain Thompson's F-22 Raptor cut through Arctic air with mechanical precision, its twin engines producing barely a whisper at supercruise velocity. His hands moved across the cockpit controls with practiced efficiency, adjusting radar parameters and weapon systems while maintaining formation with Ghost's aircraft 2 miles to his right. "Viper, I'm reading some unusual flight characteristics on Bandit 1, Reyes transmitted over their secure channel. His voice carried the kind of controlled concern that came from 7 years of flying air superiority missions along contested borders. "Look at the way it's maintaining altitude and heading. Too precise for most pilots, but not precise enough for autopilot." Thompson studied his own displays, watching the red diamond that represented their target maintain a ruler-straight course toward the Alaskan coast. Reyes was right. Something about the flight pattern suggested human control, but human control exercised with unusual restraint. Most Russian pilots he'd encountered flew with either aggressive confidence or nervous energy. This one flew like someone who knew exactly where they were going and exactly what they were doing. "Copy that, Ghost. Overwatch, any updates on radio attempts?" Thompson keyed his microphone, hopping for some sign that this situation might resolve without weapons release. "Negative, Viper. Still no response on any frequency. Bandit 1 is now inside the ADIZ. You are authorized for defensive action if the target continues toward restricted airspace." The Air Defense Identification Zone represented the first tripwire in a series of defensive perimeters protecting North American airspace. Once crossed, unknown aircraft became immediate threats requiring decisive action. Thompson's training demanded he prepare for engagement, but his instincts whispered warnings he couldn't quite articulate. His thumb moved to the weapon select switch, cycling through options displayed on his multifunction display. AIM-120D AMRAAM missiles loaded in his internal weapon bays offered beyond visual range engagement capability, while AIM-9X Sidewinders provided close-range backup. Either weapon could eliminate the threat in seconds, but elimination meant destruction, and destruction meant no answers to the questions multiplying in his mind. "Ghost, maintain separation and prepare for engagement. Something about this doesn't feel right, but we follow protocol until ordered otherwise." The mystery aircraft continued its steady approach, each mile bringing them closer to a decision that would echo through history. Captain Vera, Frostbite, Kozlova felt the familiar weight of her helmet against her shoulders as she adjusted the MiG-29's throttle with movements refined through 18 years of military aviation. The cockpit around her bore little resemblance to standard Russian fighters. Electronic displays had replaced analog gauges, and composite panels covered modifications that officially didn't exist. Her aircraft designation, according to maintenance logs that would never see daylight, was MiG-29 SMT-X, the X, indicating experimental systems that transformed a proven fourth-generation fighter into something approaching fifth-generation capability. But Captain Kozlova's thoughts weren't focused on her aircraft's classified modifications or the two F-22 Raptors she knew were tracking her approach. Instead, her mind drifted to a photograph tucked inside her helmet bag, a picture of her younger brother Alexei, taken 3 days before his death in a training accident that wasn't an accident, in circumstances that couldn't be discussed, for reasons that couldn't be revealed. Her hands moved across the control panel with unconscious precision, making minute adjustments to maintain perfect course and altitude. The GPS coordinates programmed into her navigation system led to a point exactly 12 nautical miles from the Alaskan coast, where she would execute the mission that had consumed 14 months of planning and preparation. Not a combat mission or intelligence-gathering operation, but something far more dangerous, an act of defection that could trigger the very war she hoped to prevent. Frostbite, this is Control. Report status. The voice of Colonel Victor Stone Petrov filled her helmet speakers with characteristic gruffness. Petrov had commanded her squadron for 6 years, and his trust in her abilities had made this moment possible. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that Frostbite's radio had been deliberately modified to receive his transmissions without the ability to respond. She maintained radio silence not because she was ignoring orders, but because any transmission would reveal her position to electronic intelligence gathering stations scattered across Alaska and Western Canada. Her mission depended on approaching American airspace exactly as she appeared, an unknown threat requiring immediate attention from the F-22s stationed at Elmendorf-Richardson Air Base. The irony wasn't lost on her. To prevent war, she would have to convince 2 American pilots not to shoot her down, using nothing but precise flight maneuvers and a deep understanding of how military pilots thought under pressure. Her life, the lives of the American pilots, and potentially millions of civilians, depended on a series of wing movements that constituted the most complex aerial communication ever attempted. Below her, the Bering Sea stretched toward Alaska's coast like a sheet of hammered steel under late afternoon sunlight. The range to target decreased with each passing second, and with it, the margin for error in what she'd privately begun calling Operation Last Dance. In the depths of Cheyenne Mountain's command center, General Harrison studied satellite imagery updating in real time on her primary display. The mysterious aircraft maintained course and speed with machine-like precision, showing none of the erratic behavior typically associated with probing flights or aggressive reconnaissance missions. Intelligence analysts had populated her screens with data streams, electronic signatures, flight path projections, and threat assessments that painted an increasingly complex picture. "Ma'am, we've got something unusual," Colonel Stevens announced, his fingers dancing across a keyboard as he pulled up classified satellite feeds. "Look at the thermal signature on this bird. It's running cooler than standard MiG-29 operations, which suggests significant engine modifications. But here's the interesting part. Infrared analysis shows heat patterns consistent with someone maintaining very precise throttle control. Manual control, not autopilot." Harrison moved closer to the display, her trained eye studying the heat patterns Stevens had highlighted. After 3 decades of analyzing aerial combat situations, she developed an almost supernatural ability to read the story hidden in technical data. This aircraft was being flown by someone with exceptional skill, someone who understood that every aspect of their flight profile was being recorded and analyzed by American intelligence assets. "Pilot assessment?" she asked. "Highly skilled, probably combat experienced. The precision required to maintain this flight path suggests someone with significant training and probably multiple deployments. But ma'am, there's something else." Stevens paused, his expression growing troubled. "The flight path isn't random. It's heading for specific coordinates that put it exactly 12 nautical miles from our coast, just outside territorial waters, but inside the Air Defense Identification Zone. The general's eyes narrowed. 12 nautical miles represented the edge of American territorial waters, the legal boundary between international airspace and sovereign territory. Any hostile action within that zone could be construed as an attack on American soil, but an aircraft stopping precisely at that boundary might have entirely different intentions. "Get me everything we have on Russian pilot training protocols," Harrison ordered. "Cross-reference with recent intelligence about upgraded MiG-29 variants, and get Admiral Peterson on secure comms. If this turns hot, I want the Pacific Fleet ready to respond." The tactical display updated again, showing the F-22s now within firing range of their target. In the next few minutes, Captain Thompson and Lieutenant Reyes would face a decision that could reshape the geopolitical landscape of the entire Arctic region. Thompson's F-22 maintained perfect formation with Ghost as they closed distance on their target, now designated Bandit 1 on all tactical displays. His aircraft's AN/APG-77 radar had achieved solid lock, and his weapon system showed green across all parameters. The AIM-120D AMRAAM missile in his forward weapon bay was armed and ready, its sophisticated seeker head already tracking the target's heat signature and radar return. Overwatch Viper. Target is now at 58 nautical miles and maintaining course. Request confirmation of weapons authorization. Thompson's voice carried the professional calm that came from years of training, but beneath that calm, questions multiplied. Why hadn't the target deviated course when faced with clear interception? Why maintain radio silence when even aggressive reconnaissance flights typically acknowledged American radio challenges? "Viper, this is Overwatch. You are cleared to engage if target continues toward restricted airspace. Current projection has Bandit 1 crossing territorial boundary in 14 minutes. 14 minutes. Thompson's gloved hands moved across his controls, fine-tuning his radar for maximum resolution. At this range, his targeting system could distinguish between different aircraft types with reasonable accuracy, but the electronic signature remained unlike anything in his aircraft's threat library. The partial stealth characteristics. Martinez had identified created gaps in the radar return that reminded him of modified aircraft he'd encountered during classified operations he couldn't discuss. "Ghost, you reading anything unusual about our friend's flight characteristics?" Thompson asked over their discreet channel. Reyes studied his own displays before responding. "Roger that, Viper. Look at the throttle control patterns. Whoever's flying that bird is maintaining engine settings that optimize for minimum detection while maximizing range. That's not standard aggressive reconnaissance. That's someone trying to get somewhere specific without getting shot down." The observation hit Thompson like a physical blow. He'd been approaching this intercept as a standard threat neutralization, but Reyes was right. The target aircraft was flying like someone who needed to reach a specific destination alive. The question was whether that destination represented a threat to American security or something else entirely. His targeting computer chimed softly, indicating optimal firing solution achieved. One button press would send a missile screaming toward the target at Mach 4, ending this mystery in a fireball visible from 3 states. But something about the target's behavior, the precise altitude control, the unwavering course, the continued radio silence, suggested a story more complex than simple aggression. Overwatch Viper. Maintaining lock and ready to engage, but requesting permission to attempt visual identification before weapons release. The silence that followed stretched for exactly 11 seconds before General Harrison's voice came through his headset with crystalline clarity. "Viper, this is Mountain Home. Proceed with visual identification, but maintain weapons authorization. If that aircraft deviates toward populated areas, you are cleared to engage immediately." Thompson felt a slight loosening in his chest muscles. Visual identification meant closing to within a few miles of the target, close enough to see details that might explain the mystery, but also close enough to put himself at risk if the target proved hostile. Copy Mountain Home. Ghost, we're going in for a closer look. The two F-22s banked slightly and increased throttle, their sophisticated engines pushing them through the thin Arctic air toward an encounter that would change everything they thought they knew about aerial warfare, international diplomacy, and the courage required to prevent catastrophe. Captain Kozlova felt her MiG-29's engines respond smoothly as she made subtle adjustments to maintain perfect course alignment with her programmed waypoint. Through her helmet's heads-up display, she could see the two F-22 contacts closing from her 7 o'clock position, their radar signatures now strong enough to trigger her threat warning systems. The electronic tones filling her cockpit indicated multiple missile locks from different angles, a situation that would normally require immediate evasive action or defensive countermeasures. Instead, she maintained course and began the first phase of her communication sequence. Banking right exactly 15 degrees, she held the turn for exactly 5 seconds before returning to original heading, then left 15 degrees, 5 seconds, returned to heading. Right again, left again, establishing a pattern that any experienced military pilot should recognize as deliberate communication rather than evasive maneuvering. The technique came from her grandfather's stories of World War II aerial encounters, when pilots sometimes communicated through wing movements when radio communication wasn't possible or advisable. Captain Kozlova had spent months refining the sequence, testing it in simulators, and practicing with fellow pilots who believed they were working on standard formation flying exercises. Her breathing remained steady inside her oxygen mask, but her heart rate had increased to match the gravity of what she was attempting. Everything depended on the American pilots recognizing her wing movements as communication rather than preparation for combat maneuvering. Everything depended on their willingness to see beyond the immediate threat assessment and consider the possibility that an enemy pilot might have reasons for entering their airspace that had nothing to do with aggression. The GPS display showed 11 minutes to her designated stopping point, 11 minutes to execute the most dangerous defection attempt in modern military history. Through her canopy, she could see Alaska's coastline emerging from the haze on the horizon, a thin line separating her from either freedom or death. Her modified radio equipment crackled with intercepted American communications, fragments of conversations between the pursuing F-22s and their command structure. She couldn't respond to their challenges, but she could hear the tension building in their voices as they closed distance and prepared for potential engagement. Unknown aircraft, this is United States Air Force. You are approaching restricted airspace. Identify yourself immediately or face defensive action. The transmission repeated on multiple frequencies, growing more urgent with each iteration. Captain Kozlova continued her wing-rolling sequence, varying the timing slightly to ensure the pattern couldn't be mistaken for simple flight control adjustments. Right roll, left roll, return to straight and level flight. The movement was subtle enough to avoid triggering defensive responses, but distinctive enough to catch the attention of experienced pilots. Behind her, she knew Colonel Petrov was probably wondering why she hadn't responded to his earlier radio check. In approximately 30 minutes, when she failed to return to base, alarm bells would sound throughout the Russian military command structure. Search and rescue operations would launch, followed quickly by diplomatic inquiries that would reveal the truth of her intentions. But by then, if everything went according to plan, she would be in American custody with intelligence information that could prevent the war both sides seemed determined to stumble into. Thompson's F-22 closed to within 35 nautical miles of the target, close enough for his advanced sensors to begin resolving details invisible at longer ranges. His AN/APG-77 radar painted an increasingly detailed picture of an aircraft that definitely matched MiG-29 proportions, but showed electronic characteristics unlike any Russian fighter in his threat database. "Ghost, are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Thompson transmitted over their secure channel, his voice tight with concentration as he studied the data flowing across his displays. "If you mean an aircraft that's rolling its wings in a pattern that looks suspiciously like communication, then yeah, I'm seeing it." Rays had been tracking the target's subtle maneuvers for the past 3 minutes, timing the wing movements and nodding their consistent repetition. "That's not random control input, Viper. That's someone trying to tell us something." Thompson felt his tactical mindset shifting as he processed this observation. Standard threat protocols didn't account for enemy aircraft attempting communication through flight maneuvers. His training had covered hundreds of scenarios involving hostile intercepts, but none involving potential attempts at non-verbal communication from aircraft that refused to respond to radio challenges. "Overwatch, Viper. Be advised, target aircraft appears to be executing deliberate wing movements in a repetitive pattern, assessing as possible attempt at communication rather than evasive maneuvering." The pause before Overwatch responded lasted long enough for Thompson to close another 2 miles on the target. "Copy, Viper. Continue approach and maintain readiness for engagement. Mountain Home is analyzing target behavior and will advise." In the depths of Cheyenne Mountain, General Harrison studied video feeds from the F-22s targeting pods, watching the distant aircraft execute its wing-rolling sequence with mechanical precision. Colonel Stevens had pulled up historical references to aerial communication techniques, cross-referencing them with intelligence reports about potential Russian defection attempts that had been circulating through classified channels for months. "Ma'am, if this is what I think it is, we're looking at either a very sophisticated deception operation or a genuine defection attempt," Stevens said, his fingers moving rapidly across his keyboard as he accessed files marked with classification levels that required special authorization. "Intelligence has been tracking rumors about potential Russian pilots seeking to defect, but nothing concrete enough to act on." Harrison's weathered face remained impassive as she considered the implications. A genuine defection by a Russian pilot flying an advanced variant of the MiG-29 would represent an intelligence windfall of enormous proportions. But the risk of allowing an enemy aircraft to approach American airspace based on ambiguous flight maneuvers could result in catastrophic consequences if the assessment proved wrong. "What's your confidence level in the communication hypothesis?" she asked. 70%, maybe higher. The pattern is too consistent and too deliberate to be coincidental. But ma'am, even if this is genuine communication, we don't know what the pilot is trying to communicate. Could be surrender, could be a request for fuel, could be a distraction while other aircraft approach from different vectors." The general nodded, her strategic mind processing variables and probabilities with the speed that had made her one of the most respected commanders in the Air Force. The decision she made in the next few minutes would either be remembered as prudent caution or catastrophic hesitation, depending on how events unfolded. "Get me a direct channel to the F-22s. I want to speak with the flight leader personally." Thompson's headset crackled with an unfamiliar voice, carrying the unmistakable authority of high command. "Viper, this is General Harrison, NORAD. I need your assessment of target behavior based on your visual observations. Speak freely." Thompson felt a momentary surge of adrenaline at being addressed directly by a general officer, but his training kept his voice steady and professional. "Ma'am, target aircraft is maintaining perfect course and altitude while executing what appears to be deliberate wing movements in a repeating pattern. Flight characteristics suggest highly skilled pilot with possible combat experience. Aircraft shows partial stealth modifications not consistent with standard Russian fighters." "Your gut feeling, Captain. Is this aircraft a threat to American territory? The question cut through military protocol and asked Thompson to trust the instincts developed through years of aerial combat experience. He studied his displays one more time, watching the distant aircraft maintain its unwavering course toward the 12-mile limit while continuing its wing-rolling communication sequence. "Ma'am, my assessment is that this pilot wants something from us, and shooting them down probably isn't in our best interests. But I could be wrong, and if I'm wrong, people die." "Understood, Captain. Continue your approach and be prepared for anything. We're about to find out what this pilot really wants." The range to target continued decreasing as both sides approached a moment that would determine whether the next chapter of history would be written in diplomacy or blood. Captain Kozlova's navigation system chimed softly as she reached the 10-minute mark to her designated stopping point. 10 minutes, until she would execute the most critical phase of Operation Last Dance. Through her canopy, she could see the two F-22 Raptors closing distance, their distinctive profiles cutting through Arctic air with predatory efficiency. Her threat warning systems painted an increasingly urgent picture of multiple missile locks from different angles, but she forced herself to maintain steady breathing and continue her communication sequence. The wing-rolling pattern had become second nature after months of practice, but each movement now carried the weight of preventing accidental war between nuclear superpowers. Right roll 15 degrees, hold 5 seconds, return to level flight. Left roll 15 degrees, hold 5 seconds, return to level flight. The timing had to be perfect. Too fast and it might be mistaken for combat maneuvering. Too slow and it might not be recognized as intentional communication. Her modified MiG-29 responded to control inputs with the precision that came from thousands of hours of maintenance by technicians who understood that pilot lives depended on mechanical perfection. The experimental stealth modifications added weight and complexity, but they also provided her with the electronic signature ambiguity that had allowed her to approach American airspace without immediately being classified as a specific threat type. Behind her oxygen mask, Captain Kozlova's lips moved in silent prayer, not for her own survival, but for the wisdom of the American pilots tracking her approach. Everything depended on their ability to see beyond standard threat protocols and recognize that sometimes enemy aircraft approached with intentions that had nothing to do with warfare. The coastline of Alaska grew more distinct with each passing mile, a boundary between nations that represented either the beginning of freedom or the location of her death. She had long since accepted that both outcomes carried equal probability, but her acceptance didn't diminish the weight of what she carried in her aircraft's classified storage compartments. Intelligence information that could prevent the conflict both militaries seemed determined to stumble into. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory, stories of World War II pilots who had risked everything to carry vital information across enemy lines. The methods had changed, but the courage required remained constant across generations of aviators who understood that some missions transcended national boundaries and political divisions. The GPS display updated again. 8 minutes to the 12-mile limit, 8 minutes to discover whether Operation Last Dance would end in success or catastrophe. Colonel Stevens watched his displays update with increasing frequency as the tactical situation developed over the Bering Strait. Satellite imagery showed the F-22s now within 25 nautical miles of their target, close enough for visual identification, but still outside the range where aircraft details could be determined with absolute certainty. His fingers moved across multiple keyboards, pulling up intelligence databases and cross-referencing the electronic signatures being detected with known Russian aircraft modifications. "Ma'am, we've got additional information on that aircraft's electronics," Stevens reported to General Harrison, who stood motionless before the primary tactical display. Signal intelligence indicates the radio systems have been modified in ways that suggest intentional communication limitations. The aircraft can receive transmissions, but appears unable to respond on standard frequencies. Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, the first sign of emotion she'd shown since the crisis began. Communication equipment that could receive but not transmit was consistent with either technical malfunction or deliberate modification to prevent detection by enemy electronic warfare systems. In the context of a potential defection, such modifications would make sense. They would allow the pilot to monitor American radio challenges without revealing their position to Russian intelligence assets. Confidence level in that assessment, she asked. Hi, ma'am. We're reading signal patterns consistent with modified radio equipment specifically designed for one-way communication. Combined with the wing-rolling behavior, it paints a picture of a pilot trying to communicate under significant operational constraints. The general studied the tactical display, watching the slow convergence of American and Russian aircraft in airspace that had seen decades of careful diplomatic balance. The decision she would make in the next few minutes would either be remembered as the moment when cooler heads prevented catastrophe, or as the hesitation that allowed an enemy aircraft to penetrate American defenses. Get me Admiral Peterson. If this goes sideways, I want the Pacific Fleet ready to respond to Russian escalation. Thompson's F-22 closed to within 20 nautical miles of the target, close enough for his targeting pod's infrared sensors to begin resolving details invisible to radar systems. Through his heads-up display, he could see the distant aircraft's heat signature, painting a picture of an aircraft in perfect mechanical condition, its engines running smoothly and its control surfaces responding to pilot inputs with precision that spoke of excellent maintenance and skilled operation. Ghost, I'm getting clear visual on engine exhaust patterns, Thompson transmitted to his wingman. This bird is in excellent mechanical condition, which doesn't match the profile of a desperate pilot flying a maintenance-deferred aircraft across international boundaries. Copy that, Viper. I'm also noting that fuel consumption patterns suggest this pilot has been flying very efficiently, probably to maximize range. That's consistent with someone planning a long-distance flight rather than a quick reconnaissance mission. The observations accumulated into a picture that increasingly suggested careful planning rather than spontaneous aggression. Thompson's tactical training had taught him to look for inconsistencies in enemy behavior that might reveal true intentions, and everything about this aircraft's performance suggested a pilot operating under a detailed flight plan rather than improvised hostile action. His weapon systems remained armed and ready, but Thompson found himself hoping that visual identification would provide answers that would make weapons release unnecessary. The wing-rolling communication had continued throughout their approach, maintaining the same precise timing that suggested either exceptional pilot skill or automated systems designed to mimic human communication patterns. Overwatch, Viper. Request permission to close to visual identification range. I need to see this pilot's face to make a proper threat assessment. The pause that followed stretched long enough for Thompson to close another mile on the target. Viper, this is Mountain Home. Approved for visual identification, but maintain weapons readiness. If that aircraft makes any aggressive movement, you are cleared to engage immediately. Thompson felt his heart rate increase as he prepared for the closest encounter with an enemy aircraft in his 11-year military career. The range closed to 15 nautical miles, then 10, then 5. At 3 miles, Thompson could see the aircraft clearly enough to confirm it was indeed a modified MiG-29, but modifications unlike anything in his threat identification manuals. The aircraft's lines had been subtly altered with what appeared to be radar-absorbing materials, and its electronic signature continued to show characteristics that didn't match standard Russian fighters. But it was at 2 miles that Thompson saw something that changed everything. Through his targeting pod's high-resolution camera, magnified and enhanced by sophisticated image processing systems, he could see into the cockpit of the MiG-29. The pilot's helmet was turned slightly in his direction, and even at this distance, he could see enough detail to determine that the pilot appeared to be female, unusual for Russian fighter aircraft, which typically weren't assigned to female pilots in frontline roles. But more importantly, he could see that the pilot's hands were visible on the control stick, and she was deliberately executing the wing-rolling maneuvers he'd been observing. This wasn't automated communication. This was a human being trying to tell him something with nothing but aircraft movements and what appeared to be considerable courage. "Ghost, are you seeing this?" Thompson transmitted, his voice carrying a note of amazement that he hadn't felt since his first solo flight in an F-22. "Copy, Viper. That's a human being trying to communicate with us using nothing but airplane movements. I've never seen anything like it." Thompson's finger moved away from the weapon release button as his tactical assessment shifted from threat neutralization to something far more complex. He was looking at either the most elaborate deception operation in modern military history, or an act of individual courage that transcended national boundaries and political divisions. The range continued to close as both pilots approached a moment that would determine whether the next few minutes would be remembered as the beginning of understanding or the end of two lives. Captain Kozlova felt her breathing steady as she caught sight of the lead F-22 Raptor approaching from her rear quarter, its sleek profile unmistakable even at several miles' distance. Through her rearview mirrors, she could see the American fighter's distinctive diamond-shaped configuration cutting through Arctic air with mechanical precision. Her threat warning system screamed constant alerts about multiple missile locks, but she forced herself to maintain steady hands on the controls and continue her communication sequence. The moment had arrived for the most dangerous phase of Operation Last Dance, establishing eye contact with the American pilot while demonstrating non-hostile intentions through body language that could be observed through cockpit transparency. She adjusted her position in the ejection seat and turned her helmet slightly to the right, ensuring that her face would be visible to the approaching fighter's targeting systems. Everything she had trained for, everything she had sacrificed to reach this moment, came down to whether an American pilot she had never met would recognize her humanity rather than simply seeing an enemy target. The intelligence information locked in her aircraft's storage compartments, details about Russian military planning that could prevent the war both sides seemed determined to create, would be worthless if the next few seconds ended in missile launch rather than mutual recognition. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. In war, the greatest victories often come not from destroying enemies, but from convincing them that you share common ground. Captain Kozlova had spent her entire military career believing in those words, but she had never expected to stake her life on their truth. The GPS display showed 5 minutes to her designated stopping point, 5 minutes until she would execute the final phase of her defection attempt. But first, she had to survive the next few seconds of visual identification by pilots whose training demanded they treat her as a threat until proven otherwise. She raised her left hand from the throttle quadrant and placed it against the side of her helmet in a gesture that could be seen through cockpit glass, a deliberate movement that no automated system could replicate, proof that a human being sat in the cockpit of this modified MiG-29. Then she resumed her wing-rolling communication sequence, each movement now carrying the weight of preventing accidental nuclear war. Below them, the Bering Sea stretched toward Alaska's coast like a frozen highway between two worlds, a boundary that had seen decades of careful diplomatic balance, but had never witnessed anything like the drama unfolding 38,000 feet above its surface. Thompson's F-22 closed to within 1 mile of the target aircraft, close enough for his targeting pod's cameras to resolve details that transformed tactical assessment into personal encounter. through high-resolution imagery enhanced by sophisticated computer processing. He could see the pilot's face clearly enough to determine not just gender, but approximate age and the unmistakable bearing of someone with significant military experience. The pilot appeared to be a woman in her 30s, wearing a Russian flight helmet and oxygen mask that couldn't quite conceal features that spoke of intelligence and determination. But more importantly, she was looking directly at him through her cockpit canopy, her hand raised against her helmet in a gesture that could only be interpreted as acknowledgement of human connection across the boundaries of nationality and military allegiance. "Ghost, I'm looking at a human being who's trying to communicate with us," Thompson transmitted, his voice carrying amazement and uncertainty in equal measure. "This isn't some automated deception operation. There's a pilot in there who wants something from us, and shooting her down might be the biggest mistake we ever make." "Copy that, Viper. I'm seeing the same thing. But the question remains, what does she want and can we trust whatever it is?" Thompson studied his displays, noting that the target aircraft continued toward the 12-mile limit at steady speed and altitude. Everything about the pilot's behavior suggested someone operating under a specific plan rather than improvised actions. The modifications to her aircraft, the precise flight path, the communication attempts, all pointed to careful preparation for this exact encounter.